So, welcome to the closing session of the Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development 2022. We've been discussing throughout these 3 days the intersection between environmental deterioration and insecurity and between environmental action and peace. And what we want now, dear panelists, who I'm about to introduce, is to be very forward-leaning. I think that we've had a lot of concentration, quite rightly, on what the difficulties are, what the problems are, what the complexities are, the bitterness and some of the grief of experience on the ground. And putting none of that aside, bearing it in mind, the responsibility then is to find ways of moving forward. And I think that we have a very good panel, a really excellent panel to be it's not closing the discussions, it's closing our discussions at this forum. The discussions will continue. We're always learning, we're always developing. But here for this closing session, a really tremendous panel. First of all, sitting right on my immediate left is Johanna Lissinger Peitz, who is ambassador, and she is the head of the Secretariat for the preparation of the high-level intergovernmental conference next week, which we know in shorthand as Stockholm Plus 50, because it's the conference which is the 50th anniversary of the first ever such high-level conference held here in this city in 1972. And Johanna, we know a little bit of what it's like to prepare a conference. It's high level in a way, but it's not the high level that you're talking about. So we are incredibly grateful that you've managed to find time to take out of what must be a really busy agenda right now. Come and join us here and look forward to and beyond Stockholm Plus 50. And then one along from Johanna is Ambassador Ahmed Abdel Latif, Egyptian career diplomat, and your background, a couple of decades of experience as a diplomat. And now the Director General of the Cairo International Center for Conflict Resolution, Peacekeeping and Peace Building, and with whom we're working and discussing heading towards COP27, which will be held later this year in Egypt, held in November. And at the far end, Canadian filmmaker Kasha Sequoia currently making a film, but has also previously made films on the intersection between climate change and conflict and issues of social justice and fairness. And on screen, behind Ahmed and Kasha, is Chibeze Ezekiel, whom I'm really pleased to welcome here, who's a Ghanaian, and I think in Ghana at this moment. And Chibeze is the executive coordinator of the Strategic Youth Network for Development and has been a member of the International Advisory Panel for the Environment of Peace. And if you've been paying attention through this forum to introductions of people as being, and a member of the International Advisory Panel for the for the Environment of Peace, or those who've been introduced as being a member of the Youth Advisory Panel for the Environment of Peace, then, if you also listen to them, you will have understood why our report had a good chance of having high quality, because we really have had an extraordinary panel. So, Johanna, we've had 3 days, as you know, of talking about the intersection between environment, security, peace, and development. How can these kinds of issues be reflected in Stockholm Plus 50 next week?
Thank you very much, Dan, for that question and for having me on this panel. And it may be the kind of closing of your 3 days, but I also feel that this is very much the beginning of a quite intense week in Stockholm next week with Stockholm Plus 50. And we tend to talk about Stockholm Plus 50, but I would actually like to kind of start with recalling the longer title of Stockholm Plus 50, which is A Healthy Planet for the Prosperity of All, Our Responsibility, Our Opportunity. It's one sentence. It's actually quite a beautiful sentence because it is very much connecting people, planet, prosperity. And in a way, that is also what you have been speaking about this week from a different angle than we will address it. But having looked very much on the Environment Peace Report and having the opportunity to discuss yesterday evening with some of the colleagues present here today, I think there's a lot of coherence and consistency in the messaging. And what I think I wanted to do for this intervention was to look at some of the key messages that we have heard coming out from the preparatory process, from the regional consultations, national consultations on Stockholm Plus 50, and put those very much, I think, in the concept of some of the key priorities and some of the principles from the Environment and Peace Report. Stockholm Plus 50 is also, I think, a meeting which is, it's not a climate meeting, it's not a biodiversity meeting, it's not a pollution meeting, it's a meeting about addressing the nexus between these different areas. It's a meeting about looking at what are the challenges, what are the synergies between those, and how do we address them together. Because we are, I think, more and more moving into the implementation phase, in a phase where we're looking at the institutions, the UN system, our country's national institutions, on how are we set to deliver on the crisis that we are in. And I think it's that questions that we also hope to approach from a Stockholm Plus 50 perspective. So it's really about, and this is the challenging part because we all represent different disciplines, but it's really about stepping out of our own silos and being able to take a step back and look at how do we address those nexus. Someone also told me early on that Stockholm is the perfect opportunity for a serious point of self-reflection, of looking at what is the system that has taken to where we are, and how do we need to change that system for actually respond to our science and to the challenges in the world we are in now. So without absolutely not prejudging any outcome of next week, because I don't want to jump ahead to the actual meeting, but still there has been some key messages coming out from the process that we have had up to now. And I think these, for many of you, will not be any news, but I still wanted to just pick up 3 of them and then put it in the wider context of the discussions here today. One that we, I think, have heard consistent throughout the preparations is the importance of a strong multilateral system as a key to joint action. And this means that all of the global institutions need to work towards the same end. In a Stockholm Plus 50 perspective, we have addressed the question from climate neutrality, nature positive, zero pollution. If I look at the Environment Peace Report, it's very much the combined method of security and environment crisis. And if you combine the two, it means a strong multilateral system to actually put the planetary crisis together with the context of security crisis and vice versa. So that's something that I see is kind of aligning the messages, but from different perspectives. And it's not enough that we manage to do one of the two. We have to actually combine also the different words. The second message that we have seen is very much that the legitimacy of the actions are increasing by bringing in a wide variety of voices into policy making, into the decision making. I think this corresponds very well with, I think, your principle 5, by everyone, for everyone. So the same, I think, approach again. But let me also say that I think having worked with Stockholm Plus 50, and someone told us early on, try to do it like a different meeting, which is a fantastic vision, but also be frank, it's not easy to do things differently within the context of the rules of procedure for how the UN meetings should be proceeded. So I think if we are honest and true about the sense of being inclusive in a meaningful way, we also have to look at how can we do it today and what needs to change to do it better tomorrow. And how do we also do that inclusiveness in the sense of not just working with civil society, well-recognized organizations, but how do we bring in the wider grassroots perspectives, which is a challenge, I think, for many of us. The third one that we have seen is the importance of daring to address the transformation of current economic systems and the transformation of some of the high-impact value chains that stands for lots of the impact on nature and climate. And here again, I think putting that message together with the message of a just and peaceful transition, if we succeed in doing that, I think we have actually reached a far way. And this is about looking at how does the transition, which have some consequences maybe for the north, but completely different consequence for the south. How do we put those together, and how do we bring all those consequences into the discussion? And then finally, I think coming back to, how do we then address this next week? Because we all meet in international meetings, but I tend to say that it's actually what we do in between the meetings that makes the biggest difference. So I think we are very much also encouraged in a way, those of you, I think I met already some here in the break, who will participate in both meetings. So those of you who will actually also then speak next week, to be able to address those meetings and bring into the meetings. We have also heard, and this is my last point, a very strong message on urgency of action. And I think it says in the report, in the final recommendations, that all of the recommendations presented in the report can be implemented within a few years. So if those recommendations can be brought into the context of the Stockholm Plus 50 discussions and draw to the attention of the meeting, then I think we have actually reached quite a far way, because the longer we wait, the more difficult the consequences will be, the more expensive the effects of inaction. And putting together, I think, that transition for nature positive, for zero pollution, for climate neutrality, together with a just and peaceful transition, is very much a strong narrative. And I think the work that you have done here today, the report, the work that we are preparing for Stockholm Plus 50, if we can combine it, we are very much on the right way. Thank you.
I think that's really helpful, because it's really, the use of the word if is very important at that point, because it says, do something and then the good consequences can unfold, but the possibility is there. But I want to ask you one thing, which is, I know you're being asked all the time, but do you think Ukraine, or the war in Ukraine, is going to be casting a shadow over next week's conference?
I think let me put the question in the context of that when we started the preparations for Stockholm Plus 50, we did not foresee the pandemic. We did not foresee the war in Ukraine. So that has also changed, I think, the context, not just the global geopolitics, but also the context of what are the conditions and circumstances for national implementation. So what we have seen is, I think, that in a sense, a 50-year commemoration of environmental multilateralism has been maybe even more important in that sense. I think we have also seen that some questions that when we started the journey were maybe less present in the narrative for Stockholm Plus 50 have become much more present. I'm thinking above all in general on food, agriculture, supply chains, which has kind of emerged as a much more important topic now than it was just a couple of months ago in this context.
So, thank you very much, Johanna. Let me move along to Ahmed Abdel Latif. And Ahmed, one of the big projects that you have on your plate is the Aswan Forum, which is happening in a few weeks' time, later in June. And then, of course, looking ahead, you have COP27. So how do you think these issues will play out in the Aswan Forum?
Thank you very much, Dan, and let me start by congratulating you and your team for very rich discussions over the past few days, and for the Environment for Peace report that will really have a significant contribution in raising our understanding and awareness about these issues. And it's very timely for us as we are preparing for the Aswan Forum in a couple of weeks. The conversations we've been having are particularly relevant for Africa. Africa, the continent that has contributed least to the climate crisis, 4% of global emissions, yet it's most vulnerable to its devastating effects, at the same time only receiving 4% of global climate finance. and added to that what was just mentioned, a global food crisis, energy crisis, and a series of cascading risks that make this conversation around climate change, peace and stability in conjunction with food security and other issues particularly timely. The Egyptian COP27 presidency, against that background, has recognized climate change and peace and stability as one of the priority areas that could be addressed or should be addressed at COP. And it has tasked the Cairo International Center to curate a bit the discussions around that, particularly in the context of the Aswan Forum next 21st and 22nd in June, and see, based on these discussions, the potential for taking forward an initiative around that, working, of course, with other countries and partners to COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. The Aswan Forum, for maybe those who are not familiar with it, is a high-level platform that was launched by Egypt in 2019 during its presidency of the African Union. We've had 2 editions now. This is the 3rd edition. And the broad theme of it is Africa in an era of cascading risks and climate vulnerability. Very delighted that Sweden is one of the strategic partners of the Aswan Forum for this edition. And I think it also shows Sweden's continued engagement on supporting peace and development efforts in Africa in the current international context, with other also partners such as Japan and the African Development Bank. A lot of common issues have appeared over the past days in the conversation that we've been having here that we will want to build on. The issue of holistic solutions and responses, the issue of preparedness and prevention, the issue of inclusiveness and the role of youth and women, and the issue of resilience. All of this will also inform and be importantly present in our discussions. Maybe we want to add a bit also in the framing of these conversations coming from also an African perspective of the importance of embedding this discussion on pathways of resilience and development. We've talked a lot about climate risks, threats, conflict, and we want to move also the conversation to peace, development, adaptation, and ensure that it is a positive conversation with a focus on making the architecture of climate and the architecture of peace talk to each other. And not only at the UN level, but also at the regional level. And in this regard, there has been an important momentum around climate change and peace and security in Africa. The African Union Peace and Security Council has addressed this issue, including at the level of heads of states in March last year. So there's an important momentum on this discussion in Africa. And we want to take that forward, particularly in the context of Africa's peace-building policy called post-conflict reconstruction and development. Maybe 2 or just 3 other issues that we want to also build upon in Aswan. The issue of strengthening national capacities. There's been a lot of talk about community resilience, which is fundamental, of course, but we also need to strengthen the capacity of governments to deal with these issues, to be equipped with the right tools to do that. And one of the areas we want to focus on, the topics we want to focus on that discussion, is institution building, resilient institutions to face cascading risks, and that is also an important conversation. Financing is also a very important conversation to have going from here. Climate finance for peace, I've seen a lot of discussion about that, and we've also been attentive to it and working on it, and we think it's an important discussion. But with the changed global landscape and the crisis we're witnessed, the discussion about financing peace and development in the area of multiple crises. Peace building, climate, food security, all at the same time. Let me end by also highlighting a point that you have also mentioned in the opening of the forum, Dan, the issue of leadership, right? We need leadership to take some of the responses forward, and leadership at all levels. We will try to do that in the COP context on this issue. Sweden is also doing it in the context of Stockholm +50, and we want to build on the conversations here at the Stockholm Forum as Stockholm +50 as we go to the Aswan Forum and beyond. But leadership also requires countries to work together across regional divides. And if I mention one example that happened recently that I thought is worth highlighting, there was a couple of weeks ago a high-level meeting of the General Assembly on financing of peace building. 108 countries came together to highlight the importance of this issue and to move it forward. And Egypt working with Sweden had a particularly important role in that achievement. So these are the kind of collaborations that we need to foster around these critical issues that impact us all.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. And I think one of the things which is already beginning to come out is the importance of the integrated approach, the linked-up approaches, and also of inclusivity, including all voices. And if I turn to you now, Kasha, I mean, in your films, you've spoken, you've created visual language, very vivid, very strongly about peace and social justice and climate action. So how do you see the interaction between these three?
Thank you so much for having me. So to me, and I think to a lot of other young activists, the relationship between climate justice, social justice, peace are inextricable. Everything in our entire, natural environment is connected to one another. In that same way, when you impact kind of one part of the system, it will have a ripple effect. So something that I've done in previous social justice trainings has been issue mapping. And you might put an issue in the center of a paper and say it's climate justice. And there's an offshoot where you might say migration is an effect of climate justice. And then from there, the increased violence against women and girls as a result of migrating. Or, for example, the effects of extractive industries, especially for indigenous land defenders. Using militarized forces to police such peoples from protecting their own lands, connected to environmental racism, and then you have instability, and again, violence. So these issues are all interconnected, and climate justice is social justice, is racial justice. If we achieve those, we will have a more peaceful world. So to me, it's really hard to disconnect. And I think for a lot of youth living on the front lines of those effects, seeing the intersections in their own communities, it's impossible to think that they're not connected, and to have to convince policymakers that they aren't siloed in the way that we have thought about addressing these issues. We need to, I think it's not the responsibility of youth to educate policymakers on how these issues aren't siloed. I think it's the responsibility of policymakers to look outside their own experiences in the ways that they haven't experienced maybe those effects firsthand, but to bring those voices to the table and then give them the power to make decisions because they are experts on their own experience. So, I had a really interesting conversation with a friend of mine and a couple of friends of mine who worked on the Environment of Peace report, and we touched on, our relationship to nature and how we've gone about thinking as humans as the top of the food chain, and the way that we extract from nature and exploit nature. We are treating nature violently, the same way that we might treat other humans violently because we don't see them as humans. When we are in conflict situations, you dehumanize the enemy, so to speak. So the same way, climate and conflict and peace and justice, we need to rethink how we address the issues. We've been operating in a system of hierarchies for too long, and something that the climate movement has done really well is decentralize and work horizontally. Yeah. So I think that that's really important for addressing all the issues together.
I mean, there's a couple of things in there which I want to pick up and just give you a chance to say another one or two lines about. One is, it's not us, a political lobby or a group of researchers or a movement that is connecting peace, and the environment. They are connected. And one of the things which I found really interesting in writing my part of the Environment of Peace report was to try to find a way to both to understand and then to express that you have this sphere which we call security, full of interconnections, right, of the kind that you've just been talking about when you talked about violence and its various different courses, right? And we have this sphere which we call nature, full of interconnections, which you haven't gone into, but like, you know, wolves affecting the course of a river, trees affecting the rotation of the planet, connections that are hard to grasp sometimes, but are real. And then these two spheres integrally interconnected. And I realized that in some way I'm writing against a whole way of thinking. And that was the thing that I wanted to get your line on, right? There has to be a new way of thinking about us and our relationship to nature.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, the structures of, the climate movement talks a lot about capitalism and colonialism, and these are structures and systems that have oppressed people and oppressed nature for centuries. And of course, it's going to take a lot of work to unlearn. And, you know, with the existing structures that we've built, it's a challenge to meet the needs of youth in this time of urgent converging crises. But it's also important that we start to have those uncomfortable conversations and unlearn the ways in which we all have bias from our experiences, and the ways that we all have to, I guess, work together despite those differences, to address the challenges at hand. So I guess that's what I have to say about it.
So now I want to go from you to Chibeze. And Chibeze, maybe you can at least nod or thumbs up if you can hear me properly. I'm assuming you can, but yes, you can, great. So we've been talking then about linked problems and linked action. And Ahmed particularly mentioned the importance of linking peace building, adaptation, and resilience. How do these kinds of issues and linkages play out for you in your work with the Youth Network?
Well, thank you very much, and good evening to everyone. I hope I can be heard loud and clear. You can. Thank you very much. So it's a great privilege to be here. Sorry I couldn't join in person, but I'm happy to be on this panel. So in terms of the linkages, I think that and I agree totally with Kasha, that we cannot disconnect issues around security and then climate change. So for me, for some of us, what we are hoping for or want to see is that to flag very strongly the issues of insecurity, issues of security, and when it comes to climate change interventions, particularly as Stockholm 50 and also at COP27. Much as we talk about resilience, we talk about adaptation, we talk about climate finance, it is very critical and very important to also flag the issue of peace building or issues of security. I cannot belabor the point that when it comes to insecurity or when it comes to war or when it comes to aggression, young people are usually the ones who are leading the charge, especially in this part of Africa or sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, if you watch television, if you watch the news around war, I mean, you see child soldiers, children holding guns, you know. So when it comes to conflict, it's all about young people. And so that shows the critical role that young people play if we need to want to deal with the issues of insecurity at the same time addressing climate change. What we have done in our own small way as a youth network platform is, one, to demonstrate the fact that young people are not only aggressive, young people are not only considered, you know, as agents of, you know, war and confusion, but given the opportunity, given the enabling environment, young people can become change agents, you know, in the fight against climate change and also in promoting peace building in the world as a whole. So I'm going to share just one or two key steps we have taken to demonstrate that commitment from our point of view. Number one is the fact that we are currently developing a youth strategy for climate action in Ghana, where we are hoping to inculcate issues around insecurity, issues around conflict, that as one critical area to ensure that young people are considered in Ghana's climate change agenda. Over the years, our policymakers and decision makers often develop policies or ideas or strategies on behalf of young people. And normally there's no consultation for young people, and we believe that that's where the error or that's where the mistake is. To get young people to be involved or to play an integral role in the development agenda, it is important to dialogue with them. It is important to engage them. So whatever comes out as a policy or document becomes, a document that is owned by all parties involved. So it must have a sense of ownership in all this process. So our strategy is basically to demonstrate or to show the way how government ought to engage young people when it comes to climate change interventions in Ghana, and not to think for young people, but to think with young people in Ghana. Beyond just advocacy, and I think that we've seen COP meetings, young people advocating, climate action now or never, but we want to go a step beyond just advocacy or calling for policymakers to make the right laws or the right policies. To young people by themselves, offering innovative climate solutions in their own small way. And what we have done in Ghana is that we have identified about 7 young green entrepreneurs who are innovatively turning or transforming organic waste into energy fuel, like pellets and briquettes, as a contribution to the fight against climate change. One is leading to employment creation for them, and number 2 is also dealing with the issue of deforestation. So just to create that environment that young people also are agents of change, and therefore they must also be involved in the process, and so that they will not spend much time becoming the agents of social vices, as they are known to be. So that is for us one key example that we are demonstrating in our own small way. Again, if we look at the Glasgow climate part, one of the expectations or the requirement is to have a national youth report or national youth forum annually, and we want to take that process. So as part of helping to achieve the Glasgow climate part, we intend to organize a national youth forum on climate change in Ghana, where we'll bring to bear, have that conversation between policymakers and young people. Let's have an open conversation. Let's have a honest conversation, so that as young people and the policymakers, let's see how best we can, both parties can help address climate change. And not only climate change, not only resilience, not only climate finance, but also the issues around security. Because as I speak to you now, there are a number of insecurity issues in the country, youth unemployment, all because of climate impact. A lot of young people are involved in agriculture. Some are fishers, some are farmers, but because of climate conditions, some are losing their source of livelihood. And when that happens, they are forced to go into armed robbery. Some of them are forced to use violence to survive. But if we can demonstrate that indeed, in the fight against climate change, they can actually create employment through that, then that can become a solution to the fight against climate change, at the same time addressing the issue of conflict in our society. So that is what we are doing in our own small way as a youth network in Ghana. Thank you.
Thank you, Chibeze. Honestly, I think some of that is inspirational. Integrating issues, integrating voices, integrating action, advocacy, going beyond advocacy, organizing a national youth forum. This is really tremendous. And the whole idea of essentially, I guess, young entrepreneurs developing the technologies and developing the activities which provide employment and help mitigate climate change factors and help adapt to climate change. Really, really fantastic. So I'm going to take another lap around the panel now and start again with Johanna. And then I think there will be time to open up for questions, both from the audience in the house and online. But Johanna, without kind of trying to predict or second guess, or even first guess, the outcomes next week of Stockholm Plus 50, how do you see a trajectory from there? Both through the year, we can think of the Aswan Forum, we can think of the UN General Assembly coming up, September, we can think of COP27, and then moving into next year, and we'll be thinking of the Summit for the Future perhaps in September of next year, and again COP28, which is also held in the Middle East region, because it'll be in the Emirates. So is there some sense of that trajectory going forward?
I think there's absolutely some sense of that trajectory going forward. And can I just make two reflections also?
Please do, please
what
do.
has been said? I think it's quite interesting. Before I took this job, I had worked with environment and climate in almost 15 years. But I think it wasn't until I took on this position that I actually participated in any conversation about environment, peace, climate security. And I spent quite a lot of long nights in the corridors and negotiation rooms of the UNFCCC process. So I think we still have quite a lot of work to kind of connect the communities and to bring in a lot of the discussions here into actually back to those different processes, not just the outcome of Stockholm, but all of what we have spoken about. I mean, you addressed the issues of resilience, which should, I think, influence all of the ongoing discussions in the UNFCCC, the CBD, or those for us. So there, I think we still have quite a long way to go, to be honest. It's, I think, a pleasure to be here actually with you, Ahmed, because one of the first discussions we had on Stockholm Plus 50 and on the nexus, climate security, peace and environment, was with you and some of the representatives from the COP27 presidencies on how can we bring these issues together. So we are, I think, already now looking ahead towards Sharm el-Sheikh on how we bring some of these issues, and not just, I think, this nexus, but in general, the outcome from Stockholm Plus 50. And one of the issues that has come up, someone you referred to, Kasha, I think you know, the importance of redefining our relationship to nature, which comes up quite often in all our discussions, but which also creates quite a lot of nervousness when that term is used. What does it mean? What does it mean for our economic system? What does it mean for the way we produce, consume, etc.? But it's a narrative that we see stronger and stronger, and we also hope to see some messaging out coming from Stockholm. And then it's not about always also the meetings, looking beyond towards, of course, COP27, where we already have contacts with the incoming COP presidencies in that sense, but about also looking to, I think, the Summit of the Futures in 2023, where much of the narrative that we see coming from Stockholm, some of the ones that I already mentioned, I think has a very natural pathway into those discussions. And I think we also very much, you know, will continue to convey those messages, but also very much rely on others to do so. And I also have to do one last reflection that you have heard me mentioning before, but it is about, you know, the nexus issues, the connectivity issues we talk about on the kind of interface between environment, peace, climate security, and with Stockholm Plus 50 having the ambition from the beginning of addressing that specific nexus, we also came to learn how incredibly difficult it is, because it's very difficult to find the responsible person in an institution for where these different areas actually meet. Because there is someone responsible for climate, there is someone responsible for the humanitarian issues, there is someone responsible for the security issues, but it's very difficult to find the responsible person for how do we bring it together. So that, I think, we have actually found as a little bit of a barrier to somehow hinder us a little bit to be as proactive as we wanted to be on those nexus issues. But I think, you know, where we are now, SIPRI Forum coming to an end, Stockholm Plus 50, moving to Aswan, where we have, I think, the perfect platform of continuing these discussions and also being able to show what have we actually done until, you know, the next time we meet in this context. Thank you.
So, Ahmed, I feel as if there are kind of starting to be challenges, which I'm familiar with in our preparation of this forum, and they now move on to you. What can you tell us about how Aswan Forum will succeed in integrating diverse voices? What can you tell us about how, for example, some of the initiatives that Chibeze was talking about, or initiatives like that, can be reflected in the Aswan Forum? And because the more that it can be, the more it becomes a part of our regular discourse. And then I think we get into a much more kind of positive place. So what can you say about how Aswan Forum will take that on?
Well, thank you very much. So Aswan Forum is prepared in advance with a number of consultations and meetings. And Johanna, actually, I met her first time online in one of these consultations on the interface of climate finance and peace-building finance. And it was fascinating that we learned so much from each other, and we both recognized that we maybe have not been speaking the same language. And I think the value added of this forum and Aswan and others is to make us interact and learn each other's languages and create a community around that to take this nexus forward. So that has been incredibly valuable. Same thing with the youth engagement. So we are preparing for Aswan a youth dialogue at Aswan, and preparing it, we thought to bring together African youth working on peace building and African youth working on climate, and to make them talk to each other and share initiatives like we have heard, and what can we learn from climate mobilization for the peace and security area and peace building. And it has been an incredibly exciting and rewarding journey, because the youth actually took over this process. And they went to organize consultations, and we're having consultations coming up around these issues. And so we're very much looking forward that some of the initiatives mentioned will be shared and presented there, and further contribute to this dialogue between climate mobilization and how can that also have synergies and contribute to also our thinking on peace and security.
I think that's brilliant. And I will tell you, we could have an honest exchange about this afterwards and wonder whether 4 or 5 years ago, if we had been asking each other this kind of question, the answer would have been so straightforward, so clear, with here's the example, here's the action, this is what we're doing. I think we'd have been more at the level of agreeable sentiments, but something is changing, something is moving forward in all of this, and it's really good to hear. So, Kasha, coming to you, I want to just switch gears slightly. Different causes often compete for our attention. And if we think back 3 years, I think climate change was the thing everyone was talking about. And then we had 2 years of the pandemic, and climate change activists were pleading to be heard amidst the cacophony of thoughts and response and reaction to the pandemic. And it's a little bit the same now. It's, you know, it's all about war and security, and we're trying to get the other issues to come through. So there is this thing of, you know, different causes competing for attention, different crises competing for attention. Seems hard for many people to link the different issues together into action. So I think there's kind of like 2 gaps there. One is between understanding and action, and one is between the different issues. And what do you think you can say about, you know, possible keys, possible ways of bridging those 2 different gaps?
So I guess the best place that I can speak from is my own experience as a storyteller, because my job as a storyteller is to create space for those seeking out solutions to the global challenges that we're faced with. And storytelling has the power to reach people in a way that resonates emotionally, that maybe, you know, reading an article might not, or, you know, there's various forms of media and they work differently for each person. But connecting people to shared human experiences through storytelling, you have the ability to take big concepts and personalize them. And so creating media that's digestible for young people, breaks down the issue in a way that they can understand, and bridges those knowledge gaps, is one way that I try to work to, you know, create engagement between the movements. And I guess, you know, also uplifting underrepresented stories that don't often get heard in the news cycle, which treats issues as single issues in itself. You know, the way that we get news coverage, we'll hear so much about a certain story for a certain period of time, for a very quite limited period of time, before we hear nothing about it for years. And so our patience and our tolerance for being able to handle multiple issues at a time, I think, is kind of shrinking. So it's an exercise in, again, reaching out beyond what's just in front of you. And I think that that's the role also of youth-led climate movements and youth-led peace-building initiatives, is to have those spaces to cross-collaborate and build coalitions. And that takes time and it takes work. And in the past couple years that I've been working on this project, I found it really hard to reach across, because I've come from a peace background in terms of activism, and to reach across to the climate space and bring them into the peace space, or likewise, it's been difficult, but it takes, you know, consistent effort. And to have spaces where youth from both movements can exchange with one another, I think it's really great to have intergenerational partnership to facilitate that. Because youth are doing so many incredible things on their own, but imagine if we had the partnership of those with power and finance to facilitate even greater potential. And I've seen the potential of young people around the world in grassroots positions of leadership who are creatively thinking about sustainability for the long term and justice. And so the work that they've been able to do with such limited resources is so important. And we also need to allocate more resources for them to do their important work.
On that, there's no doubt, and there's absolutely no disagreement. I think that the thing is that the fragmentation that you are trying to get over in terms of the youth movement, this is exactly what Johanna was talking about. This is reflected up, and this is not a generational monopoly on this. In fact, I think that part of what is happening is that a new and more integrative thinking is developing amongst a younger generation, and that's helping a lot. But it's been an enormous challenge. Chibeze, you've told us a bit about sort of steps towards integrating issues, integrating voices, integrating action. In order to get those things going, in your experience, what have been the kind of the best first steps to be taking?
Right. Thank you very much once again for this question. In terms of the steps, I'll break it into two. So the steps to be taken by the policymakers or the decision makers, and then the second step by the young people themselves. It is important to establish the fact that, yes, it is true young people have potential. It is true young people have the talent, they have the energy, they can be, you know, the solution, you know, to the world that we are looking for. But they can only thrive, you know, when they have the right environment, or what we call the enabling environment. And that enabling environment must be provided for by those in the helm of affairs, be it government, be it policymakers and decision makers. Because already young people are being disadvantaged when it comes to even trying to amplify or trying to upscale their small initiatives. If a young person needs financing, even to start business, it's a major challenge. So that environment becomes a disincentive for them to even take a very good step. A big company, a private sector, is easily given tax incentives by government. But how many people, how many young people with brilliant ideas are even given small incentives to start a business? Because once they start a business year 1, year 2, government is on their neck for them to pay their taxes and all that. So those kind of arrangements makes it quite difficult for young people to explore, you know, the ideas that they have. So in terms of steps, we need, you know, a level playing ground. There must be some, what do you call it, concession, purposely for young people to help them grow, to help them thrive, so that they can also upscale their knowledge and ideas. So that, for me, one steps that we need strongly from the policymakers or the decision makers. When it comes to the young people, it is very good that we are harmonizing our efforts now instead of the various pockets of interventions or fragmentation. Now we're becoming more organized, forming ourselves into movement. So for me, it's about keeping, you know, the momentum, keeping the energy going. And the more we take those steps, that becomes a motivation for other young people to join, you know, in the suit. Because as I speak, or I mean, I think we all know that one of the things that leads to conflict easily is about unemployment. It's about, you know, people losing their source of livelihood, people not having hope in life. So once they don't have hope, I mean, they're likely to involve themselves in social vices. So the next step is to encourage more youth development, more youth movements, encourage them to still commit by putting in place their skills, talent, and abilities. And once they do that, I believe that with the right enabling environment, they stand a chance of also seeing themselves as relevant actors in sustaining the environment or promoting peace building in the world. So for me, I'll take it from those two different perspectives. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, the importance of the enabling environment, and then the importance within that of young people who have the hope, the confidence, can be listened to, have the skills, and then the momentum that that creates. I think it's a crucially important point. Let's open ourselves up for some questions now. There is a couple of mobile cameras around, so microphones around, but you are being filmed, so anything you say can and will be used in your favor at a future time. Yeah, so we've got the microphones. All we need to see is a hand going up. There's no hand going up. That's not a tragedy. We can carry on. It's just they have to work harder. So I will. If the first person doesn't want to ask a question, who's the second? One online. Okay, go ahead.
We can maybe start with our online audiences. I have a very interesting one. Maybe we could kick off this, which is fitting very nicely, which you've just been touching upon. We have a question: how relevant do you see the role of culture in this? And there was a suggested idea of building an environmental stewardship.
Kasha, how relevant is the role of culture in this?
I think it's incredibly important.
Well, I know, because you're a filmmaker.
Of course. Culture, in that sense, the culture of our media and the way that we portray the world around us, has the ability to paralyze or mobilize us.
Right.
We see that with a lot of young people who are currently inactive on social or environmental justice issues, because it's not for a lack of caring, it's for that sense of anxiety that's shared by so much of our generation, whether you're concerned about the effects of the climate crisis in the future or you're worried about the impact of it on your community right now. It's really, when you see headline after headline or story after story about our last chance to take meaningful action on climate change at COP26, which passed, right? Our last meaningful chance has come and gone. What do we do? That can be really tough for young people. So creating new narratives or shaping the new narratives around what we can do to take action is really important for young people, especially if we're to mobilize them.
So it may be that when the questioner asked that question about culture, it wasn't a reference to art and so on. It might have been a reference to indigenous people and their own culture. No. I threw the question to you because I thought that we would have a question and answer about that meaning of culture, which you just responded on. Great. But what about the indigenous people and so on? Chibeze, can I go to you first of all to ask for a comment on that? I mean, we put a lot of emphasis in the report on environment of peace on the importance of engaging indigenous groups in the enhancement and protection of their own natural environment. What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, thank you. I think culture plays a very critical role. In fact, in school we were taught that culture is a way a group of people live. So people's behavior, people's tendency to behave in a certain way is usually shaped by the culture or the environment where they were brought up. For example, where I come from, or in that part of my world, I mean, some culture practices makes young people a bit timid. Sometimes it's very difficult to be proactive. It's very difficult to take initiatives. So those kind of culture don't help even especially such indigenous people to come out with some brilliant ideas. Well, some are good, some are bad, but I think that in the spirit of development and the spirit of leaving no one behind, it is important to help address some negative cultural practices to bring them up to speed on some practices to enhance them, build their self-confidence, give them hope so they can see themselves as co-creators of the kind of future that we are all hoping to build.
Thank you. And there's a question over there somewhere. Yes, yeah.
Hi. Kasha and Chibeze, something you said resonated, and I was wondering about the narratives and the narratives of environmental security and whether simply the notion of the scale of environmental degradation needs to be reframed as a form of violence, and whether as a filmmaker that's something you feel like you could capture.
I think that's a really important question. So recently I've seen a couple of movements about reframing, I guess, the climate crisis as a violation of the rights of nature, largely led by indigenous peoples, so called Stop Ecocide, to take it to our legal systems to challenge how we also, again, think about our relationship with nature and how we believe that we can continually exploit and take from nature until there's too little left for our greed. As friends of mine have said, you know, it's not a challenge of having enough resources, it's a challenge of greed. And so addressing that through film is something that I surely hope to do, especially through the lenses of youth who have experienced that violence and seen how their communities have been exploited and their natural environments have been exploited. So yeah, definitely.
And I mean, the theme has found its resonance at the UN level with the Secretary General's report, Making Peace with Nature. And I mean, the point of saying make peace with nature is because there's been the infliction of violence upon it. I also wanted to pick up the question which was asked online about environmental stewardship, which seems to me to fit with this question of violence against nature. Ahmed, what are your thoughts on that?
I just thank you. I want to come back on culture because it's a very powerful tool of raising awareness. And when in Aswan Forum we had a conversation about this last year. We're also having it this year. A lot of African artists have been impacted by the conflicts in their societies, and they have expressed that in their art to raise awareness about that. And at the same time, also on climate mobilization, they have also been active on that level. So I think these are also conversations that should come together alongside also with the role of indigenous knowledge. Same thing, in Africa, there's a lot of tradition at the community level to resolve conflicts and also to use indigenous knowledge for biodiversity and for climate. We need to bring all this together in the conversation around climate, peace, and development.
I think that's a great point, and I think that question of the traditional knowledge which is there for safeguarding these common goods is fundamentally important. Johanna.
No, but I actually also wanted to come back to the question of culture, and it depends on how you interpret it. But I think it's quite interesting to combine that question to what we spoke about. We need to change our relationship to nature, because our relationship to nature is very different depending on where you are in the world and your culture, just in the sense of it could be, you know, the city, the countryside, etc. So I think it is a very powerful tool of communication, but it's also extremely important, I think, to understand in the way of we will see different obstacles and different opportunities in changing our relationship to nature. Maybe with that cultural background. So it is, I think, a really, really important question in that sense. And on the environment stewardship, it's again, just hearing the question, there are many different ways of environment stewardship, so not exactly sure what the question refers to. There are kind of already environmental stewardships out there, which I think are quite important. And I'm now speaking on the sense of environmental stewardship for, let's say, codes of conduct for business, etc. There may be others, and I think they have proven to be quite powerful, also to show that there is a possibility to do things, there is a responsibility of actions, but it may not be enough. So it's a tool that could somehow complement what we are already doing, but is most often not enough.
Yeah, it's
depending on
part
what
of the
define
story.
With stewardship.
There another question, either online or?
Our online audiences, some of the interventions go in the same direction. I maybe just share them with you to pick from what you want to say. Some discuss how these three conferences can actually join forces and accomplish a change jointly and somehow mainstream the youth engagement. Another intervention is about, this was relating to one of Kasha's comments as well, it seems what is blocking the climate justice today and how that could be overcome. And the last point, which I also find very interesting, is how a shift in thinking, which has been discussed in the panel, could be initiated.
Okay, well, these are, three small questions. You can, well, Chibeze can't, so I'm going to let him go first on this, but the other three of you can see the green figures on the clock just as well as I can. So you know approximately how much time we have. What I suggest is that you pick a question and go with it. So Chibeze, over to you first. Could you hear the question?
No, I can't hear the question.
Oh, sorry about that. Then I'll turn to Kasha, and we'll find a way to send you a question in the chat or something like that. Can we do that? Yeah. Okay, so Kasha, over to you. Pick a question and off you go.
Oh, okay. Which question do I pick? I only really heard two questions there, which is how can we mainstream youth engagement at global forums like COP26, and then how a shift in thinking can be initiated.
And the other one really was, what's the key thing that's blocking climate justice?
Okay.
So, like I said, they are small questions.
Yes. I could think of a lot of things blocking climate justice, but I probably couldn't express them at the moment. I'll start with mainstreaming youth engagement. I would say that in previous negotiating spaces like COP26, I know it was an issue of COVID-19 restrictions, but a lot of civil society were not allowed to witness the negotiations firsthand. And I think that that's a really important part of the process in order to drive that engagement. And I would say that that's one thing, allowing young people to have an opportunity to understand how these processes work if they have the privilege to be in those spaces, making more of an effort to invite youth from frontline communities with the support of youth, perhaps nonprofit leaders, because I think a lot of the times youth from frontline communities directly don't get the opportunity to engage in those global forums. And having dialogues where you're not just consulting, but actually being given power to influence policy making and decision making, I think that that would be something that I would advocate for. And I don't have all the answers, but that's where I would start, I would say.
So I want to jump to Johanna now, because Johanna, in your earlier comments, you remarked on the idea of creating a different kind of conference. And then you talked about the difficulty of doing that. And when you have government representatives discussing and negotiating on behalf of their governments, it's a difficulty in principle. It's just not just a sort of a pragmatic problem about how to then encourage and facilitate youth engagement at the meaty end of the process, where government representatives are going to say, no, that's just for us. Have you found any ways out of that, or is it only that you can make the process more transparent, perhaps?
Well, thank you for the question, and it's a question I think after this years of preparation that I could speak at length to. I think we have tried our best in the sense of trying to involve youth from the beginning in the planning, in the kind of framing of the conversations. I'm fully aware that I know that many think that we haven't done it sufficiently, we haven't done it enough, but I think we have tried to do it. And I also always try to say that, if I participate in a webinar and have a discussion with youth, that is actually influencing my next meeting when I meet with my minister, because I actually heard messages from the youth. It may not always show, but it's a way of doing it. We have tried also in the leadership dialogue, which is having a slightly different set of rules on how we can conduct the leadership dialogues, to making sure that we have youth both participating as scene setters, but also speaking from the floor. I think we did actually achieve some kind of a small milestone in the preparatory meeting in New York, where at least I heard from the youth themselves saying that it was the first time, I think, ever that you had 5 youth representatives speaking at the same day in the General Assembly in that meeting. So we have moved it some small steps. I think it's incredibly important to think about what is it that we would have liked to do that we've actually in the end could not necessarily do. And then also always being honest, I would say, with, I'm happy to hear other views, but if you invite to a conversation, always being honest with, how do we take these comments on board, and what is it that we can't take on board, and why can't we do that? Because if you do work as a representative for the government, or if you, represent the government in the UN sometimes, you can't take on board of everything. But the feedback loop is something that I think we can all improve. And last comment, I think there is also going to be an event at Stockholm Plus 50, which is youth-led on youth from Stockholm to Sharm el-Sheikh. So that is also, in a way, kind of securing the messaging from Stockholm to
COP27.
COP27.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Chibeze, have you received the questions now in a chat form?
Yes, I have. So let me go for the third question.
Pick a question and go for it.
How can a shift in thinking be initiated? So I'll pick it again from 2 different angles, because over this period, over the years, we've virtually relied on the government policymakers to come up with the right policies, the right laws. In Africa, I can speak from my perspective, or in Ghana specifically, we have all the laws, we have all the policies, we have all the beautiful strategies, but implementation is always the problem. And there seems to be some disconnect between the policies and the people on the ground, or let me call it indigenous people or community people. What I will think as a solution is that let's pass the burden from the policymakers to the people on the ground, the indigenous people or the community people. Because if somebody knows that a habit or an attitude will lead to his or her own benefit, the person does not need a law or a policy to act right. So when people begin to understand the impact of their own actions, either directly or indirectly on them and their neighbors in the community, that will change their sense of thinking, that will change their attitude towards practicing good behavior. And when with them in practicing good behavior, that can lead to the kind of change we want to see. Because if I know what is right for me, I don't need the law, I don't need the policy to do the right thing. So I must first appreciate and assimilate and understand the benefits of doing the right thing. So if as a citizen, I have to cut down on emissions, I have to, as much as possible, avoid conflict with my neighbor. For the benefit of society, I don't need the law to make that happen. So I think that with time, in terms of the thinking, let's also place some responsibility on people in the community who, in their own small way, can also contribute to the kind of peace and stability that we all deserve or we desire. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I think the combination of sort of thinking about empowerment, responsibility, and community is all being linked together. Once again, Chibeze, thanks very much for that. So, Ahmed, you can comment on what you like, but the question which has been left unanswered by your colleagues is blocking climate justice. What is blocking climate justice?
I think I will link it to the issue of thinking, shifting our thinking. Some of these ideas take time to find their way, but I think I see sometimes a lot of skepticism that nothing changes, etc. But it's not true. I mean, conversation of climate justice compared to a couple of years ago has, taken a huge importance, and it has also even resonated in the Paris Agreement and in other aspects. So that is an example. Look where we are on climate adaptation and resilience today compared to a couple of years. On peace and security, peace building today, what it represents compared to 10 years or 20 years ago. So I think that there is this narrative, and the shifting of thinking is possible, but I think we have to push it with leadership, with ideas, and with connecting to the ground. And if I can just connect that to an anniversary we're celebrating, or should be celebrated and thought of this month. This month of May is the 30th anniversary of a document that was launched in 1992 by the then Secretary General of the United Nations, Boutros Ghali, called the Agenda for Peace. And in the Agenda for Peace, he really laid a vision of including for the first time peace building that shaped the UN for many years to come. A couple of months later, the same year, we had Rio conference and we had the climate convention. And today, with all we know, we have the capacity to connect these conversations. And he said something in that report that I want to end up with saying, we must be guided not by the precedents alone, but by the needs of the future and of the shape and content that we wish to give it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think that all four panelists have really responded really well to my challenge, which was to be forward-leaning and to be finding the possibilities for things to do. I think there's a fundamental rule, law of life. If you say something is impossible, you make it impossible. Now, that doesn't mean that if you say something is possible, then it will happen. But if you don't think it's possible, it's not going to. So thinking that it's possible, thinking that there are ways forward, is one of the conditions for success in this extraordinary enterprise which we're all embarked on. I want you to thank the panel, including the absent Chibeze, and then I'm off stage. Let's go.
Ambassador Eliasson, dear Jan, this moment represents the closing of the 2022 Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development, but it also represents the moment when you will make your last intervention as chair of the SIPRI governing board that you have presided over for the past 5 years. And most strikingly, it also represents some kind of conclusion to your almost 60-year career in the service of peace. And I'm very hesitant to say the end, because you're still very much in demand, and you will, from now on, transform into a distinguished SIPRI associate. We have been talking a lot about youth, and I would like to invite you to offer some key concluding insights to share with the younger generations. And it could be either from the past 3 forum days, it could be from your 5 past years as board chair, or it could be from your entire life experience. Your pick, Jan. You have the floor.
Well, Johanna, you are taking a big risk here. How long are you staying? Well, the last words that echo in my brain and memory is from Dan. You mentioned this meeting and this group and their work as an extraordinary enterprise in which you are engaged. And I thought I would take that as a point of departure, because I ask myself pretty often, why did the Stockholm Forum become, I hope I can modestly say that, became such a big success? It was now 7 or 8 years ago, and I think we pushed the button that you all are part of in what then followed, namely that we saw that we couldn't solve our problems in our own area, that we had to reach out to others to get the dynamics of action. And that goes both for actors and subjects. And when we then allowed this to be meetings that could flow out of just a meeting at coffee time, and people gather down, and you found government sitting with think tanks and civil society and business, then you saw the power and beauty and joy of cooperation. And that is now what you are doing. You are in the midst of a transition. And it is the most necessary transition that I can think of, because we cannot make the kind of progress that we need unless we work in this, on the basis of the word together, the most important word in the world. And if we do that now, if we do this transition right, then we could perhaps lift the spirits in a world which is now a worried world, rightly so. You asked me to go back far, be careful, but I was 5 years old when the war, Second World War, ended. Later in life, I realized that the period between 1930, apropos transitions now here, the world from 1930 to 45 is probably the worst, one of the worst in human history. You had Stalinism and gulags, and you had fascism in Italy, and Japan and Germany, of course, Nazism, you had the Holocaust, you had the Second World War, 50 million people killed. For the first time in history, more civilians than military were killed in that war. First time ever. During the war, the ideas started to develop and emerge on creating a new world, a new basis. A basis of international law, humanity, democracy. And what came out of that was, of course, the meeting in San Francisco, 1946. 45, sorry. I was distracted because I was just remembering that I have it in my pocket. It is. I did that automatically this morning, but it was... So that was created, and then what happened 3 years later? You had the 1948 Human Rights Declaration. What happens else? You had the Geneva Conventions. You had the Refugee Convention 1951. We Europeans got the coal and steel community, which was not only about coal and steel, it was about stopping wars between Germany and France and European countries, sadly, to bring that to mind now. And the world was sort of based on building a future on international cooperation, democracy and human rights, and of course development as part of that. That's what I came to do when I started in the diplomatic service in 1965. And there was constant work on taking the claws out of that horrible old war and the new Cold War, and we got the confidence building measures, 1975, final act. And all the time, there was an optimism about the future, even if we had the Cold War. We felt in that negotiation in 1975 that the Cold War had to end. It took 14 years for the wall to tumble down, but it was sort of had to happen, because the two main tenets that I was mentioning, democracy, human rights on the one hand, and international cooperation, multilateralism, they were the ones guiding forces which were never doubted. Of course, there were totalitarian societies that fought for it nationally, but the sort of international trend was, yes, we got to have international cooperation, yes, we got to have respect for human rights and democracy, and we must lift those in poverty. That was driving us. So here we are. I left the UN 5.5 years ago. after a fantastic period of work with colleagues who sit here in this room, and people in Africa and other regional organizations with whom I worked, and it was the busiest time of my life, the most work, but also most joy that I've ever experienced. It was just a tremendous experience. But it is sad to see that optimism that sort of carried us all the time has got quite a big hit. And that's why I say what you do here, and the way you now want to translate the answers to the question, how, are more important practically than the answers to the question, what? Because our frustration comes from the fact that we know that wars are terrible, that we know that poverty is horrible, that we know that human rights violations are unacceptable and utterly horrible to see. All that we know. Then the question is, how do we do it? And you are now in that transition. We are now in that transition. And that's where we have to look ahead and, with a sense of urgency, really act now and not let ourselves be delayed. I said always to my colleagues in the UN, where we were faced with, particularly for me, the worst burden was the horrible continuation of the war in Syria and the war in Yemen that we tried to prevent and didn't succeed to prevent. The generals in the area thought it would be over within 3 months, by the way. But when we had these depressing moments, which were some, of course, also during that period, I always said, listen, United Nations is a mirror of two things. United Nations is a mirror of the world as it is. And it's not a pretty place. But the United Nations is also a mirror of the world as it should be, that charter. And our role, and this goes beyond the UN, our role is to diminish the distance, the gap, between the world as it is and the world as it should be. I was about to say that's the meaning of life. But that is exactly what we need to do. And this means that I ask from my colleagues to be very realistic. Oh no, don't paint any rosy pictures of the situation. Get the real facts. A Finnish president said once, I was impressed by that statement, he said, the foundation of wisdom is knowing the facts. And once you have that, then it's, as I said, not a pretty place, but you know where to go. You know the facts. Then you just simply have to mobilize energy to do something about it. That's where I have a lesson from Olof Palme, whom I served with, the Swedish Prime Minister, legendary. When I was in too much a hurry as his diplomatic advisor on different issues, he stopped me in the midst because he wanted to be through and not leave anything undiscussed. You know this, Charlotta. So he said, stop it, John, stop it, John. One hell at a time. Be focused. Don't get depressed about what happened in the past. Don't get worried about what happens in the future. We deal with this issue now. Another legendary person, Dan, is Alva Myrdal, the first chair of the board. I'm proud to be part of that succession, who was criticized for believing in total disarmament. A young diplomat, he was not promoted later on, but he asked her in a very sort of superior way, Madam Myrdal, isn't it quite unrealistic to expect to have total disarmament? And she answered, looked at him with her blue eyes and said, young man, it's not dignified to give up. In Swedish, det är ovärdigt att ge upp. So that's the kind of line I just want to leave with you, that we have to now see the world as it is, realize that this is a time of transition, and then move on and act. And the hope factors are there. My God. Women and girls. Can you imagine the enormous potential that still remains on the power of full empowerment of women and girls in the world? We had horrible setbacks recently in Afghanistan, of course, and elsewhere also. There are even debates in America that remind us that it's not a battle that is won. But I see an enormous potential in this, and it is a matter both for men and women to make sure that that potential positive force is really being used. Second, youth. Kasha spoke about this recently so beautifully. Since I came back from the UN 5 years ago, I go to the schools of my grandchildren. My wife claims that I get younger for every visit, because I'm so encouraged by these meetings, sitting with them and talking about environment, talking about peace, talking about trust, talking about how you are with other people. And we must learn, and this is important, we must learn not only to work for young people, we must start working more seriously with young people. They should be part of the discussion of the future of employment and hope and peace and all these matters that decide whether they will run with the baton of democracy. If they don't get that sense of having a responsibility for creating peace, sustainable development, respect for human rights in a democratic format, standing up for justice and solidarity, well, what will happen? Especially since we now have this negative development. We have a horrible, absolutely unhistoric, terrible war going on in Europe. I thought it was enough to have that horror in Syria going on now for 10 years. And Yemen, absolutely unnecessary. And by the way, here I can be open, since I'm away from my responsibilities soon. Next week it's over even with SIPRI. But the fact that there is no binding Security Council resolution on Yemen is a shame. I can understand intellectually, politically, why you don't have a binding Security Council resolution on Syria or on Ukraine. But why not on Yemen? Where are the national interests of US and Russia in Yemen? They should sit down like the Catholic Church when they elect popes. They should be locked up in a room and negotiate until the smoke comes out. And only then would they be able to come out. They should use diplomacy, this beautiful gift that we have and that many of us have here in this room. Fantastic tool, the power of the word, the power of timing, the power of cultural sensitivity, the power of personal relations, all this to get the tools out so that we can deal with these issues. So, yeah, okay, well, it wasn't planned, it just came. But anyway, this is only to sort of encourage you to see the moment, this moment of transition. I pointed to the transition from the horror period of 1930-45, and then the period afterwards where everything was hopeful, and even when the wall fell down, we were jubilant. But now, let's face it, we have more of an uphill. And then I think of a quote, by the way, Samuel Beckett. Some of you know this quote, perhaps, because when I was depressed and didn't succeed, which is as often as I fail, as I succeed, Beckett has this quote: ever tried? Ever failed? No matter. Try again. Fail again. Fail better. In other words, we have to understand that realistically we cannot solve the Israeli-Palestinian issue in a very short time. If at all, I hope. In the end we will. But the issues are such that we have to realize that we have to take step by step also. And this, I think, is so important because we have to, here I come back to the point of why this forum is such a success, is that we have to do it step by step, establish our alliances, get our partnerships through, put the problem in the center. Don't ever put bureaucracy in the center. Put the problem in the center and ask yourself, who can do something about this problem? And it turns out it is going to be governments, parliaments, civil society, the academic world, media, and then gather them around the table and then come out with an informal or formal division of labor. That's how we solve problems in the future. This is the new method. This is the extraordinary enterprise, Dan, as you indicated. But you're onto it, and you should feel a lot of hope. And never give up, as I said. I remember all my favorite quotes now. I will finish. I give you my really favorite quote. But I take now the biggest risk ever during my whole SIPRI career, because I forget this in the midst of the quote. I will walk out in shame here from this building. But this is also my final words on the driving forces that have been important in my life, and which I think are important if we are going to make it. I read Bertrand Russell's autobiography at age 26. And I've never read a more beautiful piece of English language than the prologue of his autobiography. And the first paragraph summarizes it all. He wrote this at age 85, so there's still hope. He had a very rich life. He was a demonstrator on atomic weapons. He was a Nobel Prize winner. He was a great scientist, of course. And 3 marriages. I don't know why I say that, but versatile man. And he writes, hopefully, I quote him correctly now. He writes this in the beginning of his autobiography, in the prologue, first paragraph. 3 passions, simple but overwhelmingly strong, have governed my life. The longing for love, the search for knowledge, and an unbearable pity for the suffering of mankind. These passions, like great winds, have blown me hither and thither in a wayward course over an ocean of anguish, sometimes driving me to despair. End of quote. So I suggest yes to the answer, yes to the longing for love. I suggest yes to the search for knowledge. I suggest yes to the pity for mankind. But I suggest no to the despair. So, go to work. Thank you very much.